Welcome. Good evening. Hi, I'm Risa Kaufman from the Human Rights Institute at Columbia Law School. I want to welcome you and thank you for coming. The Human Rights Institute is really thrilled to be hosting tonight's event, which has been organized and is co-sponsored by the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And really thank them for inviting us to join in this event. The Human Rights Institute and Columbia Law School for the past several years has had a really wonderful working relationship with the two special rapporteurs who are with us this evening, Olivier de Schutter and Magdalena Sepúlveda. So we're really delighted to be invited to host this event where we can analyze and think carefully and deeply about the influence and the impact of the UN special procedures whose mandates focus on economic, social, and cultural rights. With the mandates expiring in the next year, we think it's a particularly timely event and an important conversation as we think about how to deepen their legacy and think about opportunities for the future. So I just want to turn it over to Ignacio for this conversation and just invite you all to join us afterwards if you have time for a more informal conversation outside in the lobbies. We continue the conversation. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Risa. My name is Ignacio Saiz. I'm the director of the Center for Economic and Social Rights here in New York. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to the Human Rights Institute for hosting us. I'm thrilled that we have in the room with us two people who are very special rapporteurs, who are, they would be embarrassed for me to say this, but who are somewhat towering figures, I think, within the UN human rights system. And pioneers, particularly in advancing the recognition and implementation and realization of economic, social, and cultural rights. Magdalena Sepúlveda, who is the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, first appointed in 2008 as independent expert and then renewed as Special Rapporteur. Magdalena is a lawyer from Chile, who was also, up until relatively recently, research director of the International Council on Human Rights Policy. And we also have with us Olivier de Schutter, who is Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, also, I think, appointed 2008, around the same time as Magdalena, who in his spare time is professor at the Catholic University in Louvain. It's important to stress that the special rapporteurs are not paid UN staff members. They exercise this role in a purely voluntary capacity, which is great in terms of giving guarantees of independence, but I'm sure both Olivier and Magdalena would say it's somewhat a source of problems in terms of capacity and time and balancing your day job with your UN human rights advocacy. But it's an important feature to note of the rapporteurs. Let me just, before handing over to them, let me just put this conversation in context. As Risa mentioned, most of the ESC rights, economic, social, and cultural rights focused mandates of the special rapporteurs are coming to an end next year. I think only two, education and culture, are continuing. And so this is a moment really for reflection on to take stock a little bit of what has been the experience of the current mandate holders and what lessons can be learned for their successors. I think probably most of you in the room are familiar with what the special procedures are. Never has a more boring term covered or masked what is in fact a passionately interesting role. The special procedures of the Human Rights Council are independent human rights experts who are with mandates to report on and advise on human rights from a particular thematic or country-focused perspective, or indeed in some cases they have a focus on a particular population group. These procedures have been around for a long time. I think the first was created by the then Commission on Human Rights back in the 70s. But the economic, social, and cultural rights mandates are a relatively new phenomenon. I think since the late 90s, 1998 was the creation of the mandate on education. Today, of the 37 thematic rapporteurs that exist, 8 of them, depending on how you count them, 8 of them have an explicit and core focus on economic, social, and cultural rights, while of course many others who are mandated to address the rights of specific groups, indigenous peoples, IDPs, migrants obviously also have a strong ESG rights component in their mandates. So currently, in addition to extreme poverty and the right to food, we have mandates on education, foreign debt, health, housing, water and sanitation, and most recently cultural rights. These mandates, or these people, I prefer the people are not procedures and mandates, they're people, play a very critical role within the UN human rights system. Their work provides guidance on the scope and content of specific rights, particularly important in the area of economic and social rights, which are still somewhat marginalized or subordinated in the UN human rights system. But they also advise and provide guidance on how human rights protections can be made more effective for particular disadvantaged groups. They have contributed, and in both your cases this is truly the case, contributed to the development of soft law standards, in other words, to the fleshing out of normative standards from the particular thematic perspective of the mandate. But they also analyze how states comply in practice with these obligations, and I think this is what gives the role, in a sense, a harder edge. They undertake country visits, they bring alleged violations to the attention of states through their communication procedures, and they conduct thematic studies, often on very challenging emerging issues such as financial regulation or land grabbing, usually informed by consultations with civil society groups and other stakeholders. And this is something I want to stress before handing over. These are not ivory tower experts. They're human rights advocates, and I think the two people we have with us are really wonderful examples of that. Yes, they engage in high-level dialogue and technical cooperation with states, but they also maintain a very close connection to civil society groups and organizations in their country visits, in their consultations. They always reach out to the most affected by the issues that they work on, ensuring that their recommendations really reflect the lived experience of those with most at stake. And it's for this reason that their recommendations have often been used at the national level as a very powerful ongoing platform for advocacy, sustained at times over many years. I myself have witnessed how the recommendations of the two special rapporteurs on the right to food on Guatemala have served as a mobilizing platform for Guatemalan civil society groups. And their advocacy role is at times most visible, I think, when making statements, very often joint statements, or issuing calls at strategically important moments on strategically important issues, whether it's the financial transaction tax or getting inequality on the agenda of the post-2015 development process, or more recently a very timely joint statement on the POSCO steel construction of the steel plant in India. That advocacy role and that assertiveness has at times meant that special rapporteurs have come under attack. Sometimes at the international level, in the Human Rights Council itself, for raising taboo issues or issues considered still controversial within human rights fora, like sexual orientation and gender identity. Or sometimes, often at the national level, for daring to pierce the veil of national sovereignty. So Canada slamming Olivier for daring to question how a democracy organizes its resources and its food security policies. Or more recently, the attack on the Special Rapporteur on the right to housing by the UK. But their work is prized by many of us in the human rights community precisely because it pushes boundaries. It forges new frontiers in human rights protection and in human rights understanding. And they've extended the boundaries of human rights to neglected issues, to neglected rights, to marginalized populations. But they've also broadened the focus of human rights accountability to actors beyond the state. So it's not just governments that you're critiquing, but corporations, international financial institutions, and others. They've also challenged boundaries in many other ways. They work across the institutional boundaries of the UN to some extent, and they also work very much, particularly the ESC rights mandates, across silos of discipline. So it's as boundary pushers that we welcome Magdalena and Olivier here. I'm hoping that in our discussion we can explore how Olivier and Magdalena and their colleagues have navigated these sometimes tricky boundaries. This is a particularly critical moment, as we said, for the ESC rights special procedures. The new mandate holders to be appointed next year will have a lot to learn from the experience of people like Olivier and Magdalena. And I think as civil society advocates who seek to engage with the various procedures of the United Nations, we need to seize this opportunity to ensure that the wonderful legacy of procedures like of people like Olivier and Magdalena is not lost. So in this meeting we will be hearing from Magdalena and Olivier what they see as the biggest achievements and challenges facing their mandates. But we'll also, as I say, discuss the many boundaries that they've had to navigate and how these can be better addressed in future. We also want to end the session today with some reflection collectively on what lessons can be learned from this experience and can be conveyed to the new mandate holders to be appointed next year. So with that somewhat overly lengthy introduction, let me hand over to the people who you have come here to hear. And let me ask, by agreement, I'm going to start asking, I think, Olivier, to share with us a little bit. If you can highlight for us what have been some of the biggest achievements of your mandate and what some of the main challenges you have experienced have been.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much, Ignacio, for this introduction, which is a very excellent mapping of the issues, and let me say what pleasure it is to be with Magdalena Sepúlveda, who indeed has been doing an admirable job and working very collectively with other special procedures, which is also to be underlined. And let me say that the Center for Economic and Social Rights has been extremely supportive, and I'm using, for example, the opera framework as a way to give more concrete significance to the notion of progressive realization. I think it's extremely important to underline that special procedures depend on NGOs for knowledge of the situations that they are experienced in dealing with, for the legitimacy that they provide to some of the proposals that we make, and especially perhaps for the follow-up that they can make of various statements or reports that we adopt. So answering your question, when I entered into the mandate in May 2008, it was a very interesting time when the markets were panicking. The food price crisis was grabbing the headlines all over the world. The prices of basic food commodities had increased by 30–40%, making it very difficult for poor net food importing countries to basically satisfy the needs of their populations, which were unable to pay for these higher prices in that time. And so the question was, what was the reaction going to be? And most of the governments and the international community was pushing for solutions that were of a technical nature, boosting production to calm down the markets and to satisfy what was perceived as growing demand. And it was this tension between supply and demand that was seen as the reason for the global food price crisis. And of course, when I entered into the mandate, I began by reframing the issues slightly differently, by focusing on not the issue of prices per se, but the issue of social justice, making it difficult for the poor to have access to food at affordable prices, not because the prices were too high or too low for the small farmers, but because there were no social programs in place that allowed all parts of the population to cope with this kind of crisis. And also reframed the issue by insisting on the need for a human rights framework to be adopted to deal with this, by which I mean participation, accountability, access to remedies, non-discrimination, and so forth. But that, for me, it was in a way an opportunity, this crisis, because it allowed me to have direct access to high-level government officials worried that they were short of solutions and looking for new ideas. Secondly, it was a moment when the international community realized that there was a need for more international cooperation. In other terms, the solutions could not be purely country-based. And what happened in this sector was that a new, well, not a new committee really was established, but a committee that had been existing but relatively dormant, the Committee on World Food Security, was reformed very significantly in 2009 in order to improve consistency between different policy areas, development cooperation, food aid, trade, social protection, in order to ensure that food security could be basically the target of all these different policies. And so I took part in that reforming of the Committee on World Food Security, hosted by the FAO, but that is a very broad forum, inclusive of all governments, but also civil society, the private sector, and farmers' organizations. In the mandate, I then also developed a series of themes in my reports. I worked on seeds, on access to land, on food aid, on agroecology, and so on. And I think there's a balance to be found between reacting to crises as they emerge and basically providing responses to the questions that governments must affront or confront. And on the other hand, putting on the agenda issues that governments would prefer to ignore because they are not necessarily popular or because there is no real advocate of these issues being dealt with. And we all try to define our agenda based on what we believe should be the issues on the table, but sometimes we also have to respond to crisis, and that was certainly the case for me. I did in the course of the mandate some 12 country missions, but perhaps more interestingly, because it's more unusual, I did 2 missions to international organizations. One was to the World Trade Organization, because Pascal Lamy wanted to basically restore the legitimacy of the WTO, and felt that one way to do that was to enter into a dialogue with the human rights system of the UN. And so he agreed to my request to do a mission to the WTO, which allowed me to basically assess whether the policies recommended by the WTO were aligned with the food security policies that countries were professing to put in place and to implement. And unfortunately, the conclusion of the mission was that much more efforts should be made to align the two with one another, which ended up showing basically that the fragmentation of international law and the lack of coherence in global governance was a serious problem for the implementation of at least the right to food and probably other economic and social rights. I also did a mission to the FAO, which is even more bizarre, one would suppose, because the FAO is the main UN agency in charge of agricultural development and food issues. But it could do much more to become an advocate of the right to food, in other terms of defining as legal rights the benefits farmers get, targeting the most vulnerable, ensuring that all groups of the population benefit from the food security programs that are put in place. And largely the FAO provides technical advice to governments, and it has quite some influence on how the governments set their policies in the areas of food and agriculture, but it is not advocating powerfully for the right to food to be integrated in all these policies. And so that was a second very interesting experiment in a UN special procedure, of the Human Rights Council, basically assessing how a UN agency was contributing to the right to food being realized. The WTO is not really part of the UN, so it was more natural then to assess the WTO. but the FAO is part of the UN, and so it was an interesting exercise in whether or not it manages to mainstream the right to food in its work. So that is, in a nutshell, the main issues I've been working on. And I would say two things to close this introductory statement. One is that to a large extent, my work has consisted in building bridges between three communities which often work in the ignorance of each other and sometimes are suspicious of one another. And the three communities are policymakers, governments, NGOs, civil society, including social movements, and in my case, farmers' organizations. And thirdly, the researchers, academics, who do very important work on issues I care a lot about and that is quite central to my mandate, such as climate change, land degradation, research in agriculture and development, but are frustrated that the policies that governments design is not based on evidence, is not science-based, it's based on ideology and on, electoral calculations. And so they are frustrated, but they are delighted to help me, my work being to translate their findings into political recommendations, to help me in my work, because they feel that this way they have a channel to policy making processes which they feel they have a responsibility of using as much as possible. So to a large extent I was at the center of this triangle, translating the concerns of civil society, the concerns of scientists into political recommendations addressed to states, which states cannot ignore because they have to listen to what we say, not that they have to follow what we say, but they have to listen and to basically take a position on what we say, given the pressure that will be exercised on them based on the reports that we produce. And then one last sentence to just add that when I entered into the mandate, I thought it was going to be the continuation of my work as a researcher on human rights, and that it would be essentially desk research with some country missions, but that the nature of the job would not be significantly different from that of an academic. And in fact, what I underestimated, and I regret I underestimated this, is that the work of convincing governments to move in certain directions, to take action based on certain recommendations, is really the work that a diplomat, with the time it takes to sit down with governments to discuss these issues, requires. So I was, in the beginning, not investing, I think, enough in acting as a diplomat, but that is ultimately what our job consists in. It's not enough to have great reports, which are well researched, which are based on 56 roundtable consultations and the best science available, if you don't spend then the weeks and the months sitting in the Serpentine bar in Geneva to discuss with diplomats and to tell them, look, this is something that your population expects, this is something that is done in Brazil and that you should seek inspiration from, or that, let me be kind to them for once, is done in Canada, and there's a very interesting example that the EU could seek inspiration from. So I think that part, which is not the one I particularly enjoy, is actually very vital. Again, it's not enough to have great ideas and good research if you don't put time into making things happen. And I think that is certainly something for the next mandate that I would have to say.
Thank you. Just thanks, Olivier, for highlighting a part that a dimension of your work that I think civil society organizations perhaps are less aware of, that quiet diplomacy that you do in the Serpentine bar, or we know of the work that you do, the high-level dialogues that you have when you visit countries or when you go on other types of missions. But I think that more behind-the-scenes diplomacy is probably critical to your persuasive power as well, because it's not the written word that necessarily will jolt governments into changing policies, but more the constant pressure that can be applied in that more diplomatic setting. And I think I'd like to add to the typology of boundaries that I was trying to outline before, this kind of relational question that you mentioned, this, you feel that you're at the center of a kind of triangular relationship involving civil society, academia, and policymakers. And I think we need to reflect on that, on the symbiotic relationship between those actors. But Magdalena, does that resonate with you, what Olivier has described as the different dimensions and dilemmas of the role?
Indeed, and but I also would like to react first to this final point on being a diplomat, and I think that there is a strong link between having a well-written report. I mean, the legitimacy of the diplomatic work that it comes with the mandate, it is based on our report. So if the report were not to be solid reports, then the diplomatic part will not make sense. They will not listen to us. They listen to us, I guess, because there is a solid background in our work. And I've seen this. I mean, I think that, and one of the, and it allows me to take one of the issues that I feel very proud of with this mandate is the adoption of the guiding principles on poverty and human rights. And it is quite an interesting set of a standard setting, because this was actually, it was a process that started in 2001 with the former Commission of Human Rights. Then the former subcommission adopted a text that it was one of the very, very few work that the Human Rights Council kept alive after the disappearance of the subcommission in 2006. But it was completely blocked. There was a draft, and I said that it wasn't good enough, and there was several consultations, but it was completely blocked. And there was this process of engaging with the states, and the Human Rights Council passed through different resolutions, allowed me, or invited me, basically, to get involved in this process, and finally to prepare the draft. And what is interesting is that it was a state-owned process. I was kind of invited by the council to draft a document that they adopted. And it's quite interesting that it received a lot of political support. It was adopted by consensus at the Human Rights Council in 2012. And at that moment, for example, the US was part of the council and joined the consensus. So that was a very important political breakthrough. And then it was endorsed by the General Assembly in December 2012. And that was a process, and again, it's also interesting to bring other issues that Olivier was mentioning, that it was the crisis. To what extent the crisis impacted in our mandate, in many of the ESC right mandate, but I have to say, though, that I do not consider my mandate as a purely ESC right mandate. I think that poverty is just an issue in which the indivisibility of rights is very clear. And actually, the consequences of the crisis worldwide have shown that it is all types of rights. It's civil and political rights, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights that have been impacted for people living in poverty. But it is interesting. I mean, it is true that we started at the moment in which the crisis was in its peak. Well, it was a little bit later. We started in May, and then the peak of the crisis was around October, November, and December. But we continue to see the impact of the crisis. At the beginning, I have to say, I thought that the crisis was an opportunity for a state to be much more transformative in their policies. And now I think that the time has passed, and we haven't seen that transformation anyway, but it has had an impact on our work. With in particular case of my mandate, it was quite interesting that a mandate that it was called independent expert on the question of human rights and extreme poverty. After the first 3 years of the mandate, it was changed, and on the question was dropped out. And I think that that is very significant. I mean, it was significant, the change of independent expert to special rapporteur. Although in formal term there is no difference, and we are all special procedures in the same level, it is true that in people's mind and also in delegates' mind, in the state representative, they kind of try or often tend to call independent expert to new mandates in which they don't think that there is a clear link. So the change to a special rapporteur was important, but I think that most importantly was that on the question was dropped. And I think that the meaning of that is that there was no longer any doubt that there is a strong link between the enjoyment of human rights and the situation of poverty. And this was after that very well recognized in these guiding principles on extreme poverty and human rights. So I think that that was very significant. The attention that the crisis has paid, I mean, the policy response to the crisis has also been important for our work, and I engage in the same process that Olivier was describing in terms of rephrasing certain topics, certain policy responses from a human rights angle. When I started in 2008, already social protection, for example, was very important. International financial institutions like the World Bank was lending and giving actually a very important, significant amount of money to different countries to implement certain particular social protection mechanisms around the world. And today we have seen that social protection has been considered the quiet revolution in development. As a very important tool, states in the MDG summit in 2010 and repeatedly the G20 has called social protection as the one crucial tool for the compliance with the MDGs and for development. However, in 2008 there was very little discussion on a rights-based approach to social protection. And although social protection systems can play a very important role in improving the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights for the population, if they're not well designed from a rights perspective and evaluated and implemented, taking into account, for example, gender concerns, they might also end up violating certain rights of the population. So it was very important to bring that issue, and that has been one of the topics that I've been working quite a lot in this 5 years. But also other aspects that, again, I think that the crisis accelerated or made more evidence the importance of dealing with that. Issues of criminalization of poverty. The crisis, it was one of the topics that I've been constantly working on. But again, I mean, the responses to the crisis, we have seen that a state has tend to criminalize poverty quite a lot, but not only political manifestation against, for example, austerity measures, but an increased numbers of laws that prohibit homeless people from city centers, for example, or that criminalize poverty through increasing requirements and conditions in the enjoyment of welfare benefits. And then another important topic that, again, it was very evident, it has always existed, but it is very evident in time of crisis, it was access to justice, or the barriers that people living in poverty face in order to have access to justice. And this was also very important. And finally, another important topic that I think that Olivier has also worked on, but it is unpaid work of women. Not only when women work, for example, within the family as farmers or in a small household enterprise or company, and they work for free, But in particular, I will say, for me, it is particularly striking that issues of unpaid care work that fall mainly on women are still not in the political agenda, for example, of the post-2015 development agenda. We cannot achieve gender equality if we don't recognize that all over the world women work more than men if we take into account unpaid care work. And that is a major obstacle for women's development and the enjoyment of rights. So there have been several issues, and that again, it has been extremely impacted by the crisis. When public services are cut, are women who assume and fill the gaps. So if there is less money and the kindergartens are closed, and if it's less money for community services or for investing in public health, women, again, within the households are the ones that are filling the gap and doing extra work. So, as I said, I mean, there's been several topics that there have been always problems with them, but the crisis has made them I would say somehow inevitable, that if we don't address them, we are not going to see any solution.
And yet, as you said, that window of opportunity, the crisis seemed to be an opportunity because it laid bare some of the fallacies underpinning our global economic order. And yet that window of opportunity seems to be closing. And really there's been very little accountability, certainly very little accountability of the financial sector, very little accountability of international financial institutions for their responsibility. In that context, what broader lessons would you both identify in terms of how the work that you do, say in normative development or in monitoring and scrutinizing how states apply their existing obligations, how can that be brought more effectively to bear in this post-crisis context? Because both of you have worked very closely on processes of norm development which are very directly related to the context that we're in. And yet, to what extent has that had an impact? And so my question is, what remains to be done in order to remedy that accountability gap that we're seeing, and to stop this window from closing?
Well, I think international law develops very incrementally by a process that is really organic, in which you first reiterate what governments have already agreed upon language, and then you put some more flesh on it, building on it, to bring them to accept new ideas and to move in faster in the direction that you feel is necessary. There is a difference, I think, between two aspects of our goal. One is monitoring and passing judgment on what states do, which we tend to do in country missions, which we tend to do in letters of allegation that we send to them, and on the other hand, the more proactive approach we take when we put forward new ideas that we hope shall be influential in shaping the debate. But as to how to shape the debate, I think Magdalena may have a different view on this than I, but I think it requires many years of advocacy for one idea to get across, and at least I have been dedicating my thematic reports each time to a different topic. So the topic is studied for maybe a year and a half before the report is published, and then there's maybe 6 months of advocating the recommendations, but that is 2 years for new ideas to be maturing and to be presented and then to be advocated in favor of, which is actually very short, because this period is not enough to change a bureaucratic culture, a particular way of approaching things, and the routine way that administrations have of working. In my case, it worked to some extent for some concepts such as agroecology, which I put forward and very much pushed for. But clearly, for real policy shifts to occur, you need to invest more time than we actually can afford, given the breadth of the topics that we aim to cover. I mean, compare what Magdalena and I did, for example, to what John Ruggie did as special representative of the Secretary General on the issue of human rights and transnational corporations and other business enterprises. That's the official title. He had a mandate that was 3 years, extended once for 3 more years, so 6 years in total. And he began with a very lean framework, protect, respect, remedy, that was so obvious that no one in the room could possibly disagree. And then having gotten the governments to agree on that very lean skeleton, he then could say, well, now that you've agreed on this framework, this is actually the flesh on the bones of the skeleton, and now you have to agree on all the implications, which are the guiding principles of this human rights. But this took 6 years. It took 6 years, it absorbed a huge budget in consultations in various parts of the world with all partners that had to be cajoled into continuing to come to these consultations and so on. And for one single result, right, which is not insignificant, far from this, but in terms of content, it's you know, a fraction of, I think, the themes that Magdalena and myself studied. And I think it was a very, if you wish, a monomaniac approach, one topic, business and human rights, that was very strategically pursued over the period of 6 years. This is what it takes. And I think to have a broader transformation of the kind that some have dreamt of or dreamed of in the wake of the financial crisis would require even much more. And so there are some themes that are now emerging in you know, food reserves, for example, tackling financial speculation, or developing impact assessments of trade policies, but it takes more time than the one we had, I think.
I'm very interested in your question. I think that, I think that it's very interesting to think about the crisis still as an opportunity. Although, as I said, I mean, at the beginning, I really thought that it could be used as more transformative, and then I have a more pessimistic point of view. But in those days that are very sunny and I sleep a lot and I wake up very optimistic, I still can think that there are topics now that are on the agenda, on the political agenda. They were not in the past. Inequality was not there before. The Indignados movement, the Occupy movement, the 99%, and now it is everywhere. I mean, you cannot read now, not even The Economist, without reading about issues of inequalities in the political agenda, even for the right. And it's taking more and more. I also think that issues like the importance of looking at the impact of macroeconomic policies, taxation, fiscal regulations, the impact of transnational cooperation, I think that all these topics are now in the agenda. I mean, that is a significant step. Much more needs to be done. And I think that this should be also a wake-up call to the human rights movement. And we have seen in the reports of Olivier, in my reports, and the report of other special rapporteurs, that increasingly we are addressing this topic. And these topics were topics that the human rights movement was very cautious and for years and years never addressed from a human rights perspective. And now more and more we see that special rapporteurs and treaty bodies are taking these issues, that the media, the public is more aware of this issue, and I think that there remains the opportunity. to provoke a change. That it doesn't depend on the work of special procedures, of course. It has to be a global impact. Otherwise, again, I don't sleep well and I feel pessimistic. So it is. I mean, I think that we're in a complicated and very complex period of time, and we're really in a crossroad, in my view, that it requires to address all this topic. And human rights advocates and researchers and civil society have to look at this issue from a rights perspective. And we all should empower ourselves to address this topic. These topics should not longer be left to the technocrats, to the economists. We have to deal with them and start mobilizing behind this topic.
That's certainly music to our ears at the Center for Economic and Social Rights, because as you know, that's an issue that we're, the issue of tax and fiscal policy and mobilization of resources needs to be addressed from a human rights perspective, and it's only just starting to be. And I think the work that you're doing is extremely, it's spearheading those broader efforts. So clearly the crisis has been a major contextual factor shaping both of your agendas and priorities. I wanted to ask about another contextual opportunity, perhaps, thinking in terms of sunny days and blue skies, which is the post-2015 development process. Because again, both of you took up your mandates more or less at a time that the debate was starting to take off around what would replace the Millennium Development Goals in 2015. I think 2010 was really a turning point in terms of that debate. And now, as you know, there's a very vibrant global discussion around this. To what extent has that process also influenced your choice of priorities? To what extent have you sought to influence that process and bring expert human rights thinking into those debates at different levels?
Well, I was actually very fortunate that the food systems are seen as a key part of what it shall mean in the future to have sustainable societies. So that the sake of small-scale farmers, the importance of rural development, the importance, of course, of adequate nutrition, were very much central to the debate in the Rio conference of June 2012. The right to food itself was very explicitly endorsed by various documents, including the outcome document, The Future We Want, and later the high-level panel of experts document on the future sustainable development goals and so on. So that was certainly something extremely encouraging. And yes, like anyone else, I suppose, I contributed to the debate, but the debate was fed from so many other sources that it must have been just one part of a much, it would have been only one part of a much larger set of demands on this process. But luckily, thanks to the context, it is something that emerged as quite important. Now, what Magdalena and I did together are two things. First, insisting on inequality being very much at the top of this agenda of the future SDGs, when the MDGs, in contrast, looked at absolute deprivation, but not at growing inequalities as a problem per se. And secondly, we proposed that concrete measures should be taken to universalize social protection in accordance with the ILO recommendation 212 or 202, sorry, adopted in 2012 by the International Labour Conference that concerned universal social protection clause. And we published this document advocating for a global fund for social protection that in fact proposed a sort of international mechanism to support countries by matching funds to invest in social protection rather than in short-term emergency measures to respond to the crisis affecting the underprivileged and the poor. And I was surprised to see the level of interest with this proposal, in part because it was the missing step in the agenda that the ILO had managed to have approved by the governments, in part because it was, there was a clear donor fatigue when donor states provide support to specific short-term projects and want serious investment to be made in people. And in part, as Magdalena rightly notes, because of the financial crisis and the economic crisis, especially showing the fragility of the poor households in the absence of standing social protection schemes. And the proposal, I think, was also sort of interesting to many parties because it was a balance between international support for economic and social rights on one hand, and the need for domestic efforts to be put in making the right to social security a reality on the other hand. And in my mandate, it certainly has been a constant preoccupation to have a balance between the international community's responsibility, including by acknowledging the existence of extraterritorial obligations in the area of economic and social rights, and on the other hand, the responsibility of governments towards their own populations. It's unfair to say that governments should do their homework and things will be fine if they are not supported, but it's equally unfair for them to just escape responsibility because they're not receiving the support that they request. And so, in all, I think, and that is at least what I tried to do, in all the proposals I made, I tried to have a balance between the two levels. In part, in order to have the support of different regional groups preoccupied by different dimensions of the mandate, and some unwilling entirely to recognize the duties of international assistance and cooperation, and others unwilling to move an inch unless they receive that kind of assistance and cooperation from the international community. So this is why the idea of an enabling international environment and domestic efforts that have to be supported are both equally important.
I think that Olivier more or less responded the whole your whole question from all the angles, and I think that it's true. We are very small actors as taking individually to influence this huge agenda. On the contrary, what happened in my view is that there is a lot of interaction with the post-2015 agenda or with the MDG agenda. Quite notably, several ESG right mandate over the years have changed the resolution of the mandate, and they have included MDGs in their mandate. Olivier and I, both the resolutions that establish our mandates address the issue of the MDGs, that we have to address issues of the MDGs. But of course, we are small players, but the spotlight that state have given at the domestic level to the compliance with the MDGs open opportunities to interact, to try to use, to convince policymakers to take some action or another, or to refrain from doing certain practices. And I have to say, for example, that in my view, even the way in which states document the compliance with the MDGs, for example, for the MDG summit in 2010, most states presented an MDG report. And those documents at the domestic level, so for example, if we talk about, I don't know, Namibia or Mozambique, they prepare their national report on the compliance with the MDGs. And these reports are extremely important source of information because they're written in a very frank manner. They do not take into account, of course, human rights. They are not in a defensive position, in my view, in many of these reports. They really acknowledge the constraints that they are confronted with, why they are not complying with the MDGs, and this is a very important document I found, and you can find it in many states, because oftentimes when I go to a country visit and I engage in a dialogue with the policymakers, I just told them what they have said in their own national report, because oftentimes, I mean, the reality is that they've been written by consultants or with a lot of assistance with UNDP, but they're very frank recognitions of challenges. So basically, I tell them, you have recognized in this report that this and this are your problems, and that you haven't achieved any result here or there or in this other measure. So why don't you change? And there is some receptiveness because of the political spotlight. So that is very positive, and one can engage as a political strategy. The problem is that what it was not included in the MDGs was out of the discussion at the political level, at the domestic level as well. There was no money invested in topics that were not sort of somehow measurable in the MDGs. And I think that now the post-2015 discussion that has brought all these issues on the agenda, the issues that were left behind, are also very important, because I think that it is there is also an opportunity to convince policymakers that without the gaps in the MDGs, it's very difficult to move forward. So I think that, well, it remains a challenge for all of us to ensure that the post-2015 development agenda is going to be, of course, more inclusive, and it's going to have the important gaps that were not included before, starting by inequality and other important issues in regard, for example, of gender equality, that is extremely important, and many other gaps. But the positive aspect is, I try to believe that now there is consensus, and according to the latest report of the Secretary General, it should be in that way, that without human rights we cannot have a post-2015 development agenda. So now human rights should be, at least in the rhetoric, should occupy a better place, and also women's rights. But that is rhetoric, so then...
But I think this last remark of Magdalena raises an interesting point, which is what gets governments to move. And I have to say, my views on this evolved slightly over the past few years. I first thought governments were actually unwilling to be shamed for violating human rights, and that simply sort of, scolding them and recalling their obligations was the right thing to do. I realized that to be effective, you needed to demonstrate to them that it was actually useful. For example, useful in achieving development objectives. And I genuinely believe the right to food and other human rights are extremely useful in making the policies more effective, by ensuring that they reach the most vulnerable groups of the population, by ensuring that through participation that the policies are better informed by the real obstacles that people face, by ensuring that the policies are inventive, because people's ideas will be injected into policy processes. And so if governments can be convinced that they could do things better, succeed better in what they try to do anyway, particularly developing with human rights, they will then espouse human rights gladly. But if you pinpoint at their failings and at their various violations that are left unremedied, they will not care much. And except for some weak states who need to have a stateless reputation to benefit from foreign aid, and there are some such states, most states do not care much. And so I think it's absolutely vital that we accept the burden of showing the operational character of human rights as a tool that can make policies work better.
This is a dilemma in this process, because getting too drawn into instrumental arguments and having to prove the value added of human rights can only takes you so far. But it's very true that in dialogues with policymakers, it's what works. So it has to be deployed tactically. I think it's clear from where we are, and you mentioned the Secretary General's report to the General Assembly, which marks a real step forward in the recognition of the centrality of human rights to the post-2015 process. I think there are certain issues which have a much firmer foothold on the agenda now than others, and certainly inequality, I think, it's indisputable that the new framework, however it looks, will be a much more equality-friendly framework. Social protection issues, perhaps from a rights perspective, I think has a fairly decent foothold. An issue that you mentioned, however, extraterritorial obligations, that I see as being a much longer-term struggle, because those organizations, including our own, that have tried to raise the notion, that have tried to couch the notion, the concept of international cooperation and assistance in terms of extraterritorial obligations, this is really falling on deaf ears. It's still Martian language, for most states in intergovernmental processes. And I wonder if what advice you would give strategically in terms of how to take the valuable work that you've both been doing on extraterritorial obligations and the setting of soft law standards on ETOs, how to take that forward in this post-2015 debate. It seems like a critical opportunity. At the same time, tactically, it seems, it's still a frontier too far, kind of thing, for most states.
Well, I think on this point we have to make a distinction between three types of extraterritorial obligations corresponding to the duties respectively to respect, protect, and fulfill. I think it's fairly easy to convince governments that they have a duty to assess the impacts of what they do on populations outside their borders. And in fact, paragraph 61 of the Guiding Principles on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights says that much, and they've approved it. Right? So now I'm not citing the Maastricht Principles on extraterritorial obligations of states in the area of economic and social rights anymore. I mentioned paragraph 61 of the Extreme Poverty and Human Rights Guiding Principles. But that's the duty to respect, which includes a duty to assess, for example, the impacts of your trade policies, development cooperation policies, etc. Secondly, there's a duty to protect, and that means a duty for governments to control the private actors over which they may exercise influence to ensure that they do not commit human rights violations. Fairly easy too, because this is something the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights already said, and although the Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights are not very explicit on this, at least they are not explicitly excluded. So that, I feel, is also something governments can hear. What they do have difficulties with, and I agree with you, Ignacio, is a third level, right? The duty to support the realization of economic, social, and cultural rights by providing aid or forms of support. But sometimes, between these three levels, the borders are not very clear. So, for example, reshaping trade regimes to make sure that they are more development friendly. Is this a duty to respect by ensuring that trade policies will not negatively affect? Or is this a duty to fulfill by having trade policies that shall support the efforts of governments to promote the right to education, housing, food, etc.? And so sometimes it's a matter of how you frame things. So I think it's work in progress, really. But I think this example is a good one of what I was mentioning earlier, that international human rights law develops as a natural language. It's, all of us are locutors of this language, and each time we use the language of human rights, we transform it in the process. And it's not that there's one academy that decides what the rules of language are. It's that we use the language in ways that are deliberately calculated to make progress in human rights without imposing, a new vocabulary and a new grammar to governments. We just use the language, but we use it by introducing some new words now and then, and by having new sentences building on the existing vocabulary. And that is what the Maastricht Principles did, in fact, right? Not pretending to reinvent the wheel or to revolutionize things, but making explicit what was very implicit in the statements of human rights treaty bodies and courts.
Thanks, Olivier. I want to throw it open because we have practitioners in the room, we have advocates, we have very bright and committed students working on human rights, including people who've been, so I'm told, studying today the issue of engagement with special rapporteurs and special procedures. So over to you for comments, questions, interventions on any of the issues that we covered, or indeed issues that we haven't. Kathy.
So my first comment, I'll try not to make all my comments, but is that we talked a little bit, as we often do in these spaces, right, about ideas and about relationships. But what often seems to be missing from the conversation is this question of building power, right? I mean, we are losing really, really badly for many years now. It's only getting worse. It doesn't matter what the rhetoric is or whether we're able to shift it. On the ground, we know more people, we know the economic crisis has been devastating to millions of people. And in this country, they're still cutting food stamps in the middle of an economic crisis. They're talking about cutting food stamps. It's insane. So we're actually losing. And I don't think it's because our ideas aren't legitimate or our ideas aren't powerful or because we don't build good relationships. But I often think that we don't have the conversation of how to connect our ideas to our actual places of power. And we're often building our legitimacy in spaces that are very elite spaces that have an inherent contradictory challenge, which is the interests that we are trying to protect in our ideas, at least in the short term, feel to most of the participants in elite space that run counter to their own interests. So we're building legitimacy with an audience whose interests we're not necessarily putting front and center because they are not the poor. And we're actually not, just as a community, this is a broader community, often I think talking enough about how to use the expertise, the set of relationships we've built to connect it to more bases of power, or have more explicit conversations about where we have power and where we don't and how to build it. Because governments will never, I don't think will ever be persuaded because it's the right thing. And usefulness, as Ignacio points out, is only useful so long as it's useful. And when it comes up against them suddenly thinking it costs them too much or it's no longer useful, then there goes that. That's not a rights-based perspective. So, and I think that the other thing that I wanted to point out is we talk about an international community, but I think sometimes we have to name the fissures there. When we talk about the international community supporting a country, we're really talking about rich countries supporting poor countries, which is problematic because it's a global charity model. It's not a rights model. And until we have some shifts in economic structures, then we don't have a real international community that can support each other. We have a global charity model. And sometimes I wish we could spend a little bit more time talking about what shifts would create equalities geographically as well as within, countries. I have other things to say, but I probably shouldn't.
Do either of you want to come back on that? Should I take some more comments?
Well, maybe very, very briefly, I think the question of power is important. The dilemma is the following. We are trusted to be independent from any state or organization, and although, at least in my case, but I think to a large extent it's true for Magdalena too, we've been supported by social movements that are very strong, and certainly the food movement is huge in this country, like in other countries. I've been very strongly supported by a transnational movement of small farmers, the Via Campesina, that boasts millions of members. But if you're too closely aligned with them, you lose what is your added value in the system, which is to be above the fray and to have basically filtered out from the demands of social movements what is linked to human rights requirements. And so there's a thin line between seeking support and ensuring that your recommendations are basically followed upon by civil society on one hand, and on the other hand, maintaining the arm's length distance in your relationship with the social movement so that you're not simply seen as their spokesperson. Sometimes it's not very easy. But what was very clear is that governments only listen to us, at least to me, because they understand that behind my work there are many groups that are involved, interested, and want things to happen. This may not be true for other mandates, and some have a much less broad constituency, and their legitimacy is much more in purely technical and legal expertise. But for me, it's clearly been a very major part of my work.
I fully agree with your comments, and I think that. But I see your comment a little bit separate from the work that we do. We're very small players. That we are indeed supported by movement, and we try to express their voice. And I think that the beauty of the system of a special procedure is that despite the fact that it is it's this. It's not. It's not this one.
No,
Okay.
it's all right.
I think that the beauty is that we do have impact as a collective, as a mechanism, and that is quite remarkable. Sometimes I wonder. I mean, if there's been important studies documenting the impact of a special procedures. And we also have experiences of important impact that we have achieved. Minor impact, of course. I mean, I'm not talking about at the same level of what you were saying. But I think that is quite interesting. If one think that there is this crazy mechanism that it's given to individual experts that are doing this in their spare time because you don't receive salaries, you do it basically in your spare time, addressing global issues, and we do have impact at different levels. But it is a crazy mechanism, but that is, I hope that is a source of optimism. If these people, 40-something people, appointed by the Human Rights Council to do this in their spare time, have impact, concrete impact, and save concrete life. I mean, I hope that brings hope. I don't know.
I just wanted to clarify. Yeah, my point wasn't that you weren't maneuvering those spaces of power. I know you are, otherwise you wouldn't be having impact. And of course, we're all small players, so we have to collectivize. All I wanted to surface is we dedicate a lot less conversation and strategizing to that particular pillar. And I just think there's a benefit and value. We do it all instinctively, but there's a benefit and value, I think, of surfacing more and kind of trying to articulate what those strategies are. I feel like our people who oppose our views are much more comfortable with talking about power. We do it. We maneuver it. That's how you have your impact. But my only comment was to think about that that perhaps we should think about that in a more explicit way as the third leg of the stool, along with powers and ideas. I mean, along with ideas and relationships.
Okay, let me take some more. We have about 7 minutes left, I think. Let me take some more, maybe 10. Here.
Thank you, all three of you. This has been a really great conversation to listen to so far. I just wanted to offer a quick reflection and ask a question, okay? First of all, I actually appreciated your introduction, Ignacio, to this discussion. I very much agree in your characterizing special rapporteurs, but particularly these two folks that we have in the room with us today, as boundary pushers and as effective and strategic allies of the human rights movement that have really tried to take international standards to the next level in a way that is responsive, that is based in reality, and has a lot of integrity. So I appreciated the framing on that. I also just wanted to briefly say that I think that the two rapporteurs we have here in front of us have also really been strong allies in demonstrating the integral nature of a lot of the human rights issues that people on the ground are confronting. The effort that you have all made to try to generate joint statements whenever possible, to use mechanisms in ways that are uniting the different rights issues, has been really powerful when you see that from the outside. And I wanted to just commend you publicly for that, because I actually think it's helped us on the side of civil society think in a more integral way as well, perhaps about some of the issues that we're trying to bring forward to this mechanism. And of course, you've done it in such a way that is attempted to be supportive of unity between and amongst human rights defenders and other advocacy groups, and have done so with tremendous humility, even as you're being treated. I see a lot of times you guys being spoken about like you're giants and like you're heroes, and I hear Magdalena saying we're small players, but that's not the perception always, right? And so there's a lot of expectations sometimes attached to what you might be able to do in certain situations, and still a real great humility and a feeling of horizontality in the relationship between civil society and our allies that are in this position of being independent experts. So that was just to voice some things that have really been great to see and to work with as on the civil society side of things. I'd like to ask I have actually two quick questions for you, but deal with them as you're able. The first one is, I often reflect on the fact that a number of the parts of the mechanism that you work with are confidential in nature, right? I mean, if you issue a communication to a government in response to reports you've received, perhaps from trusted civil society sources, right? That letter has to maintain confidential. In fact, the even existence of the letter really should be confidential until it's made public. On the other hand, for those of us that are in a position to kind of be an interlocutor between some of the real grassroots groups that are bringing these issues up and you guys, we're of course trying to also coordinate advocacy work around the statements that you're able to come out with. And so sometimes there's a constant question in my mind about confidentiality and advocacy planning, and where those two might conflict on some levels. And of course there's a larger concern there about making sure that the overall mechanism of special procedures is supported, and that we're not working in our advocacy roles in any way to even inadvertently jeopardize some of that trust that has been built up. But so it's kind of a delicate dance at times, right? For example, I think in a lot of cases a civil society group would love to have a heads up before a communication is going to be issued, so that they could bring forward those same recommendations in their own spaces. And yet there are rules of the game in terms of timing there. So that's just something that I think about a lot, how to do our job as intermediaries somewhat in a more artful way given those restraints. That might be a complicated question for you to field fully in public. Maybe a slightly more straightforward question would be, anticipating, of course, the renewal of new mandate holders coming into this picture at this point, and in recognition of the very close relationship that you've both sustained with civil society groups and allies in the last few years, what advice would you give us to help to make your lives a little easier in your capacity of carrying out your mandate, and for your successors? If there were a few things that we could hear from you to strengthen and deepen that working relationship and set the special rapporteurs up for maximum success.
Thanks, Leah. Great comments and questions. Let me see if there are any others, and then, because that final question that you asked was in fact what I wanted to end us on more propositional terms, so thank you. Thea Goldspan from the International Network on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. I want to name you, and Kathy Alvisa, also from NESRI, the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, just to show that we have practitioners here in the room who know what they're talking about. Let me see if there are any other contributions or questions before coming back. Tanya.
So I had a quick question. Thank you very much for your
Name yourself, please.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I'm Tana Kurov. I'm from the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative. I just wanted to pick up on something that you were both alluding to about how civil society organizations can use some of the recommendations that you're making or some of the work that you're doing to advance things on the ground, right? And one of the things that, Olivier, you were saying was about language, and that there is no proprietary nature of the language of human rights. So actually we saw Nesri worked very closely with the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing, and we saw human rights organizations, community-based organizations, really deploying the language of human rights extremely effectively within their own spaces, and actually using some quite radical tactics and using the framework of human rights to explain those tactics to communities, and do that very, very successfully. And so I was just wondering what you would say, given the multiplicity of spaces that you have to work in and the very complex nature of them, some of the work that you can do can be used by us to advance the agendas that we have in more radical ways than perhaps you are able to. And do you have any thoughts about what strategies and tactics we can use to do that work on the back of the work that you're doing?
Okay. If there are no more comments or questions, I will ask Magdalena and Olivier to respond. So, commonality in the questions around how the relationship, in a sense, between civil society advocates working in different spaces and different levels and your own work. Magdalena, do you want to go first?
Our impact depends on the relationship that we have with civil society for everything. I mean, from the point of view of deciding for a theme that is going to be used at the local level, from working on an allegation letter that again it has an impact. So I see civil society has a very, very important role everywhere, in every aspect of the work that we do. We should not do academic reports that are going to be there and nobody is going to read it. It has to be a report that can be used at the domestic level. At least that is the way in which I interpret my mandate. And I have also used a very consultative methods of work. So I have engaged in thematic reports where I see that there have been civil society working on that topic and able to push that topic further. For all my thematic report, for example, I have conducted expert meetings, including with participation of people living in poverty and grassroots movements, in order to build some ownership from their part, and in order also to understand how they can use the report, but also with inviting, for example, sometimes government representative, different point of view, so also to understand what would be the obstacles, the other side of the argument. So I've tried to develop my report taking this into account and working with civil society that are already working on the topic. Then once the report is done, it depends solely, I will say, or more, I mean, the most important player are civil society that can have the capacity to bring the issue at the domestic level. And also to deconstruct our report once it is done. So I mean, in a way, civil society organizations should not, or it's not necessary that they will agree with the whole report from paragraph 1 to 67, but to be able to use the important parts of the report in a more progressive way, because that is the well. I mean, if we try to push boundaries, we still have a political constraint, a legal constraint, because we have to act within certain legal parameters and things like that. And civil society should use that to deconstruct, this is my view, deconstruct our report in order to use it to legitimize and some part of their work by pushing it forward. So I think it is a very symbiotic relationship for everything. The same for allegation letters and for country reports. In particular, for example, when we do a mission, the symbiotic relationship with civil society before the mission in order to identify the most crucial and critical points, in order to identify the windows of opportunity. I mean, governments are not monolithic, but only the domestic civil society organization knows where are the entry points. So they have to flag those entry points for us, so we can push there, and we can also sort of touch in the difficult spot, but we have to get that information. And then once the report is done, civil society, domestic civil society organizations are the ones that have to keep monitoring and holding the state accountable. So I think it is crucial somehow. I mean, if it's thinking on future special rapporteurs, that I think that will be my key message. Sort of try to work very closely with civil society and grassroots movement in order to identify the issue and be able to somehow translate those issues, as Olivier was mentioning at the beginning, to that triangle, or it can be a pentagonal, I don't know, it can be something even broader, and in which we just are trying to collect and interpret it and find the opportunities identified by others. That is the way in which I see it.
Magdalena said it all, and she said it beautifully in addition. So I have almost nothing to add but two things. One is the use of the media is very important in our work, and there's a very interesting combination between what you referred to here, which is confidential discussions with governments and exchanges, and the permanent threats of things becoming public that governments fear, and that's the only reason why they enter into discussions. They fear that at some point it shall be publicly denounced. And the second thing is we discussed a lot the relationship to civil society, but in my case, I sometimes was approached by UN agencies working with governments and not able to say things to governments that would displease them, because they are repeat players, they are in the country, they cannot afford to damage their relationship to governments, but they are delighted that I can say certain things that the government does not want to hear. So that also happens. It's unrelated to your question and to yours, but I think it's part of the picture. And I have to go.
Olivier has to go, which is why we need to wind up this discussion. Well, also because I think our time is up. I want to express great gratitude to both Magdalena and Olivier for making time to come here. I know they have a very packed schedule here in New York, and it was touch and go whether we were going to be even able to have this session. I'm delighted that we have. I think it's been a very useful and very frank and honest examination of the huge scope of the work that you do, but also the limitations and challenges that you encounter. And I think those learnings really need to be conveyed to the new mandate holders. This is just one of many discussions I think that will happen between now and probably May of next year. The new position holders will be appointed in March, and so there will be a kind of 3-month period of handover and overlap, and I'm sure there will be more formal, I guess, more systematic discussions and opportunities for handover. But I think some of the ideas that have emerged from this discussion should definitely be fed into that broader process. I want to thank you all for making the time for coming. There are some particular people here at the Human Rights Institute that I also want to thank, Risa Kaufman and Greta Mosesson. I also want to express thanks to two of my two colleagues, Alison Corkery and Luke Holland, who have been instrumental in making this happen. And again, thank you, Magdalena, and your researcher, Kate Donald, for proposing this initiative. I'm very pleased that we were able to make it happen. Thank you, everyone.